Hey everybody, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Amy Edmondson said, "Psychological safety is about building a culture of trust and respect where everyone feels their voice matters. It doesn't mean people agree on everything, but they can disagree without fear of retribution or marginalization." Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about the importance of psychological safety, cultivating a culture that embraces and celebrates being heard, how pickle brine relates to culture. Don't worry, we'll get there. Leaning into our vulnerability, and more. My guest is a husband to Julie and a father to Sophie and Jack. He's a keynote speaker, leadership facilitator, and coach, and author who, through his work, guides leaders who are committed to putting people and purpose first. He's a graduate of the Ivey Business School at Western University in London, Ontario. And he was a longtime member of Simon Sinek's team, narrated Sinek's 2017 audiobook, Find Your Why, and co-hosted the Start With Why podcast. Please welcome the Chief Vision and Leadership Officer at Shed Inspires and the man who's helping us all understand that when leaders truly listen, people step up. Shedletzky. Shed, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that very, very kind and well-researched introduction. My wife and kids thank you as well. It's a joy to be with you and your listeners.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And let me mention also for everyone that's watching and listening right now, Shed's actual name is Stephen, but as he says, and as his friends say, he goes by Shed. So that's my reason for using Shed today. So let's jump right in. I thought a good starting point for us would be for you to share with all of our listeners what your favorite thing is about yourself and why that particular thing.
Oh, wow. Favorite thing about myself. I think my favorite thing about myself is knowing that I am an imperfect, fallible human being. And it's an advantage because everyone is. And if you don't already know that, you have a problem. And so, I know you've had Rich Davini on this show, and Rich is a very, very dear friend. You've also mentioned that Henna Pryor has been on this show, and both of their work has very much influenced me. Rich has taught me that there's a difference between confidence, humility, insecurity, arrogance, right? So when confidence derails, it derails into arrogance. Arrogance is actually a form of insecurity. It's just loud, which allows us to have some empathy with folks or for folks when they're being arrogant. It's cute. They're just being insecure in a really loud way. And we can both be confident and humble at the same time, which is so hugely powerful. We can both, in any given moment, stand in, I have strengths, I have worth, I have things to offer value, as well as knowing that I'm a fallible, imperfect human being that has limitations, weaknesses, things I'm unaware of, biases that I'm aware of or unaware of. And I think it dovetails nicely with Henna's work on what it means to be good and awkward at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, so beautifully said. So let me ask you if I can pull on this one just a little bit. So imperfect, infallible. So was there a point in time in your life where you realized that that was a truth for not only you, but for all human beings? Or was this just something that you grew up with and it was just part of who you are?
That's a great question. So two things spring to mind, Jay. One is, so I grew up with a stutter. I still do have a stutter. I've learned how to work with it. My wife, Julie, is a speech therapist, which is very convenient, more so for my kids and nieces and nephews. I've learned most of my strategies. Um, but I grew up as early as sort of grade two. So that's what, 7, 8 years old, knowing that I had a deficiency, knowing that I had an impediment. And didn't really do much about it between the ages of grade 2 and 6. We tried some interventions, didn't, nothing really took. And then I utterly failed in grade 6 French class where I couldn't pronounce the word très in French class, which is like the third frickin' word you learn in French. And I'm Canadian, so it's mandatory. Très means very, très bien, very good. And I couldn't say the word because it's a harsh sounding word, a sound that I struggle with. That word struggle is a hard word for me as well, but I've learned how to navigate and say it and own it. Stephen Shedletzky is also a hard word for me to pronounce, my own name. So I've learned ways to overcome it. I still do trip up and stutter, as a lot of people do. But I learned very early on I had something that was getting in my way that I needed to work on if I wanted to feel confident and achieve more success. Um, and then the other sort of piece is just the value of team. I've been a part of some amazing teams, and I've learned the value and the cognitive diversity and diversity of strength and thought that teams bring. And so I think it's been ingrained in me that we each have our genius, and we each have shadow sides, and we each have when our genius derails. So it's just I know behind every great individual is a team, or not even behind, with any great individual is a team, and anyone who leads from the front and doesn't know that is in trouble.
That is so true and so well said. So your story and your early challenges that you were faced with the speech impediment, it's so interesting how we fast forward, and obviously you've done a lot of work, you have the tools, you've learned the tools to be able to manage through that, overcome, etc. But it's so interesting that today, here I mentioned at the opener that you narrated Simon Sinek's one of his books, one of his audio books, and obviously you're speaking on stages, you narrated your own book. And I just think it's a great testament that when you put your mind to something, when something is important enough to you, when you attach enough meaning to it, that you can accomplish so many remarkable things. And I just really, I love hearing that story, and that nothing stopped you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I mean, I'm a big believer, and I learned this through Simon Sinek's work, that oftentimes our purpose lives in what have we overcome, or what are we overcoming, and even better than how can we help others do the same. So, one version of the story is how ironic that I now speak for a living. Another version of the story is how much sense does it make that my passion is in helping others find and use their voice, because that's been my own journey.
Absolutely. So is that an experience from your life that has really shaped or informed the work that you do today? I mean, if you look over the span of your life, is that the primary impetus, if you will? Or is there more to that?
There's more. So I think it is a significant, probably primary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably primary, but there are a couple of other sort of big influences, which I'm happy to share more, or I could leave it as a cliffhanger.
Well,
okay, I'll share more.
Yeah, please do. I love cliffhangers, but I held long enough.
So a couple things. One is I grew up with a grandfather who's a Holocaust survivor. And his story of surviving the Holocaust is quite unique and different. It'll actually be the topic of my next book. I'm going to write his memoir. He passed away in August 2015 at near 99. He was a month away from turning 99. And I mean, his last day of formal education was in grade 5 or so. He punched back an anti-Semitic teacher, which was his very last day of school ever, and he joined the family business, which was becoming a butcher. He taught me, though I've not had too much of a chance to exercise this, but never hit first. But if you're hit twice, hit back twice as hard. I've been hit before,
good
but
lesson.
I've never hit back twice as hard. It's a lesson, not necessarily a virtue to practice, but it's a lesson. And so he ended up being drafted to the Polish army, fought against the invading Germans in 39, was in a prisoner of war camp for 2 years, was approached by a more senior officer to escape. They escaped, and then he walked home at night only for about 2 months, married his childhood sweetheart, my grandmother Eva, and then led a group of 7, which became 5, in hiding in the Polish countryside because he knew all the farmers and he knew all the paths. As a butcher. And that group of 7 became 5, and they had to, he had arranged a family to take their firstborn kid, which they had in hiding. But that family, in the last moment, sort of backed out for fear of being caught. And so he had to give away his firstborn. We don't know what happened. But to our knowledge, the child didn't survive. But his story of surviving was very different than a lot. It was very unique. He was sort of this heroine. He was this leader of a small group of people that survived the war because of his initiative, his leadership, his survival instinct. And so he was very open to talking about his story because in very much as an entrepreneur, he sort of called the shots. And it wasn't his choice to be in hiding, but it was his choice of how to navigate through that, which was very interesting. And so his gregariousness, his willingness to speak publicly, even though he also suffered from a stutter, very much inspired me. Wow. And as I entered my career and really lost my way early on in my career, joining the corporate world, first day on the job, 1,000 people were let go post merger. But, and starting my career coming out of business school within a year, even less, within 4 to 6 months, feeling exceptionally lost, depressed, uncertain, lacking in confidence. And I really leaned into his story. He was alive at that time, to give me a lot more courage and perspective around, I can't let my life and career go to waste. I have to live it to the best of my ability to honor his legacy and everything he's been through to give me and my family a chance at this good life. And so those are a couple, overcoming the set are probably primary, but secondary is my grandfather, another great professor at business school who helped me find my voice and use my voice. And then, feeling completely lost early in my career, and then finding Simon Sinek's work to be like, ooh, that's awesome. I want more of that. I want to live in a more inspired, safe, and fulfilled world. And so I'll just do it.
What a remarkable story about your grandfather. And I'm so encouraged to hear that that's going to be your next book, because obviously those are stories that need to be told, right? Because there's so many incredible lessons through those stories. Out of curiosity, do you have video conversations with your grandfather?
Yeah, so he did about almost 3 hours with Steven Spielberg's project, where he took all the proceeds from Schindler's List and then got testimony from as many survivors as they could. So we have I think it's about 2 hours and 45 minutes from him, a little bit from my grandmother, but she was early onset Alzheimer's at that point. So, and she also wasn't as comfortable speaking about it. And then the very first thing I did, Jay, when I graduated from college, one of the first days I got home, I probably because I had this professor who really inspired me and gave me a lot of perspective. But one of the first things I did is I took my computer and I sat down with him for like a complete day. And so I have audio recording of, I just said start. And so we spoke about it all. So yeah, I have that. I have the Spielberg tapes, and then there are other couple of events that I had helped organize for him to speak at that I have some footage as well.
That is outstanding. So, what was it about your father, or I'm sorry, your grandfather, that you learned through your interactions with him, conversations, just being around him? What was it about him and his leadership that stands out to you? So here in a horrific situation, your grandfather steps up as a leader and leads these individuals, 7 individuals, at a time that most of us could not even imagine, right? What was it about him as you think about his life and his leadership? What stands out to you?
Yeah. A couple things are salient in this moment. I mean, one is give that man an audience of one or more, and he loved sharing his story. And it was compelling and it was interesting, and sort of he was like unabashedly gregarious. And that was just like interesting. That to me is not a requisite of leadership, because I actually think extroversion or charisma can get in the way of leadership, because you often want the spotlight, and the studies have proven that those who want to be in leadership positions often make the worst leaders. It's, often more introverted, quiet, analytical folks who feel called to lead out of necessity or will or integrity or something, that often make the best leaders. So I just more make that a comment out of, he was a fairly lovable, interesting dude. Stubborn, very authentic to the point that it could get him in trouble. But he was just like, he could shift the mood of a room for better, or sometimes for worse as well. And a lot of, I look like him. I have a lot of his same personality traits. We're not the same person, but we're similar. So that's just like interesting to me. The other that I once asked him, I was driving him and his girlfriend, because after my grandmother passed away, he fell head over heels in love with an 84-year-old survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto in Auschwitz, a lovely lady named Anna. And so he literally like fell in love a second time, like head over heels. It was the cutest, most wonderful thing. And I remember I was driving them around somewhere, and I asked him, I said, we called him Zadie Ben. I said, Zadie, when you were in hiding in barns and cornfields, hiding from Nazis, did you have like a vision of this war will end, and I will create a better life for my family? Like, I kind of asked him, could you see any of this? You have 3-4 generations, you're in a safe country in Canada. Like, did you see any of that? And he went, no, I just wasn't ready to die. I still wanted to see tomorrow.
Wow.
And like, because I think one of the things, all great leaders have vision. BS. All great leaders find necessity to keep going. And sometimes your horizon can be 15 or 50 years if you're so lucky, or more. Sometimes your horizon is this afternoon or tomorrow, And the other thing aligned with that is, there have been, obviously I would describe him as courageous. And there have been moments in my life and career where I have done courageous things, but I've learned about courage. My sort of going theory with courage, Jay, is that courage is actually retrospective. I don't think that we everyone turn your keys, press the button, we're activating courage. I don't think that's how courage works. I think courage is when you do what is so plainly obvious that you must do in that moment with integrity. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it is clear. And then retrospectively, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that was courageous. But I think it's seldom that it's like, time to be courageous. Like, no, we just do the thing that we know is right. And then I think we look back on it, sometimes minutes, sometimes years, and go, yeah, I guess that was courageous. But like, I still had no other choice.
So based on that discussion around being courageous, what is, at least up to this point, what's the most courageous thing that you've done?
Oh. Have kids? I think the most courageous thing that I did was to leave corporate. I had a couple jobs early in my career. The first one, that was the one where 1,000 people were let go first day. And that one took me, like I said, 4 to 6 months to realize, I don't think this is for me, this place. Which has less to do about the place being bad and more of it just not being an alignment with me and my values.
Okay.
And then I got another gig at a big sort of accounting consulting firm, which I learned, but I also knew, it was like HR consulting, change management consulting, and it was interesting, valuable, learned some things, but I so clearly knew that I wanted to work in the make work more inspiring, psychologically safe, and fulfilling. I knew I somehow wanted to make that my everyday. And that was 2010, so close to 15 years ago. And in Canada as well, that industry was exceptionally nascent. The coaching, leadership development industry. So I was fired from my first job in a sort of George Costanza-esque fashion, which was great, kind of. My second gig at the consulting firm, I quit that one. And here's a full circle moment.
Okay.
When I quit that second job, when I got fired from my first job, I played tennis with my brother that afternoon because he was also unemployed. It was great. When I left the second job, I also hung out with my brother and we went up sort of north in the country to a lake and just had like a weekend and hung out, which again, we're very lucky to do that. And there wasn't great cell reception. I remember I got a phone call from my grandfather. At that time, he would have been 95, still very strong physically and emotionally. And he called me to give me heck. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Do you realize how much I sacrificed in my life to give you? What are you doing quitting another good job?" And I'm like, "Zadie, like, thank you." And I said, "I'm following in your footsteps. You were a butcher. You were an entrepreneur. You worked for someone for 6 months of your entire life. I'm following in your footsteps. I need to go the path less traveled. And this is what I got to do. I'm not doing this despite you. I'm doing this because of you." And that really shut him up. And he said, "Fine, just don't sell drugs."
Oh my gosh.
And yet to this date, I still have yet to sell drugs. But hey, we'll see what happens.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you.
So how do you and Simon Sinek's paths cross?
So I ended up in that very, very first job, the one with 1,000 people being let go on the first day. I was part of like a rotational leadership development program. I was assigned to my next job, which was going to be in marketing. And I was like withering. I was, my mid-20s, but I was lost and miserable and probably depressed. Um, and I remember being introduced to someone, a guy by the name of James Powell, and a friend of mine, Kendra Reddy, introduced us. I don't even know why she introduced us. I think maybe he was going into some coaching stuff and I was interested in coaching, and she's just like, you two should meet. And I was like, okay. And we were introduced, and I think we got together for dinner like the next day, which is like, when does that ever happen? But we
Sure.
very quickly got together. I shared with James that I was moving into a marketing role for a company that I quote didn't believe what they sold or how they sold it. And he went, huh, watch this video. This would have been 2010, so fairly early days for Simon and his work. I think his TED Talk came out 08, 09, and his book came out around the similar time. And so he sent me Simon's How Great Leaders Inspire Action, the Golden Circle, why, how, what TED Talk, which is now, last I checked, still the third most watched talk on TED.com. I successfully procrastinated for 2 months and didn't watch it, but then finally did. And it was great. I mean, like, I watched this talk, and my experience is probably very similar to many who have seen that talk. It was sort of this like puppy dog, like, everything this guy says, I receive as truth. I just have never really thought about it that way. But that makes complete sense. And I now have new language. And I began to draw circles on napkins and share the golden circle with anyone who would listen, because it was a simple idea that could be repeated, and when you repeat it, it can make a change. And then I went to a conference a few months later. This would have been November of 2010, to hear Malcolm Gladwell speak. It was in the convention center downtown Toronto. And unbeknownst to me, Simon was on the cover of the magazine for the event sort of brochure, and he spoke right after Malcolm. And I went to this event with friends who had heard me do the Start With Why spiel, and they're like, it's your boy. And I'm like, cool, amazing. And so I heard him speak, and I felt like I had this like clear moment of I had found my orator. Like, I found the person who is describing the future state that I wish to live in and to contribute toward. I had a chance to ask him a question. A friend of mine, Ron Tite, who wasn't my friend then, but he's my friend now, was emceeing the event. And I had a chance to ask a question to Simon. I think the question was like, he spoke quite a bit around leaders being authentic. And my question to him is, how do you know if you're being authentic? Like, what's the authenticity test for yourself? And he had some interesting, good answers. And then I randomly bumped into him in the hall, and I wrote him a message on LinkedIn. I later managed his LinkedIn. And it was kind of right time, right place. I wasn't attached to doing anything with him. I just knew I wanted to contribute in whatever way that I could. It's a movement, right? It's a movement for a more inspired, safe, and fulfilled world. And just kind of right time, right place, it happened. I ended up getting a call on the books with him, and it just coincidentally was days before I was going to go to New York to visit again with my brother. I was supposed to go with my girlfriend, but we broke up, but I still had the tickets, so I took my brother. He was a good date. And I met Simon in person, and it was just sort of one thing led to the other. They had an opening on their team, and I stepped in. So I was the fourth person to join their team in late 2011, early 2012.
An incredible meeting and an incredible way of collaborating and being able to fulfill something that is so incredibly important to you and to many others. So you're with Simon's organization for over 10 years. Was it 13, 15 years, somewhere around there?
Yeah, so I was on the team for 10 years. I still do work with him as an associate, so I still will go and share Simon's message, mostly around the infinite game, a bit with Start With Why, for audiences and their clients. So I will still bring a part of what I do is bringing that message, which marries really nicely with Speak Up culture as well.
Absolutely. So How did you personally grow through the experience of working with him, with his team? Obviously, it sounds like the stars aligned, right? Very similar values, very similar ideas around contribution, purpose, etc. How did you
Yeah.
change? How did you grow?
Yeah. Well, so the irony was the first couple of years were tough.
How?
Um, they were tough because I joined this team, which is all around fulfillment, and I felt unfulfilled in my role because I had to fill somebody else's shoes. I joined the team and they were just starting to have other folks, or one person in particular, a guy who's now a great friend, David Mead, and became a great friend. David was the first person to do speaking and workshop events on Simon's content ever. And so there was something like, you know, like Simon could say yes to like 2% of the speaking requests that would come in because he's one person, right? And so we were saying no to like 98% of the stuff that came in. So this guy, David, raised his hand and said, "Hey, I was thinking, what if I did at least another 2%? So we're saying yes to more." And Simon's response was, "David, I'm very disappointed in you that you haven't come up with this idea earlier. Like, it was a great idea." And so David was the first. Then Peter Docker, a guy out of the UK, retired Royal Air Force pilot, became the second. I became the third. But before I became the third person, I was quite young. I was still in like my mid to late 20s before I started speaking on behalf of the brand. There was a good couple of years where I was doing customer service, fan email. I was doing I was working the mailroom, and it was hard. It was hard because while I like to write an email, I'm not good at writing 15, and I'm not particularly great at systems or efficiency. I'm more of an artist than I am a systems engineer. And so while it's very easy to be like, you've written that email a bunch of times, make a macro, I'd find, yeah, well, like I can save this, but I still have to customize it. So I was doing an important job, but a job that nonetheless didn't align with my skill and strength set. And so it was hard, and I had to pay my dues and earn trust. But there was sort of this pivotal moment. I actually was interviewing to join Marcus Buckingham's team to become a coach with them, but realized I was running away from something as opposed to moving toward something. And I just gave it, I made like this deliberate sort of choice. You know what? I'm just going to try to own my house, like own my room in the house. And as soon as I made that shift, it became wonderful, and I got more opportunities, and stuff that shouldn't be on my plate came off my plate because they could trust me and they knew that I was doing it for the right reasons. So that was a big one. And then other things. I mean, Simon is such a brilliant communicator. I don't always live this, but he's taught me talk less, say more. 3/4 of an answer is better than an answer and a half. Not something that I'm naturally good at, but something that is important nonetheless. And then I also learned that I love to keep busy and I love variety. I always like having new, interesting things on my plate. Is another thing I've learned, as well as the importance of I always had a job when I had a role on the team. I always ensured that I had an internal culture job, or I had responsibilities that had to do with the internal culture. And this is something that is like number one importance on my own team, is we have to strive to practice what we preach, knowing that we won't get it right all the time. And so much of Simon's work and his concepts are around leading from the inside out, as individual leaders, as well as the teams and cultures that we have. So that is so important, a vital importance for me and my team.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So speaking about doing new and interesting things, you decide it's time to be an author, a published author, and you write, speak
Apparently
up.
so.
Apparently so, right? You write. So we're not doing emails. We're writing books now, right? It's all about
Many
speak
emails
up.
strung together. Yes.
So speak up culture.
Yes.
So I would love it if you would first, I gave a quote from Amy Edmondson at the top of the podcast around psychological safety. And I would love it if you would share with all of us what psychological safety is to you based on your experience, your definition, and why it is so important.
Yes. So I don't have a definition because one exists, and I'll lean into it. I mean, psychological safety has been around since 1960, and Amy has really amplified and taken the work to the next level. She calls it team psychological safety. So there is this notion of, do you feel safe with yourself? Which I think all leaders have to do that work to feel safe within themselves. An insecure leader is a very dangerous leader. Team psychological safety is that a group of people, a team, feels as though it is safe to take interpersonal risk. This means to disagree, to take the risk of sharing an idea that's new or half-baked, sharing feedback with one another, hopefully with the purpose of helping one another grow, to disagree and debate. And I think, if there's any one muscle we need to grow as a society right now in this algorithmic polar age, is our ability to disagree with someone and respect them at the same time, and to even disagree with curiosity. We can do these things. We're very capable. It's hard, but it's possible and it's worth it. We can talk about concerns. We can admit mistake, and we can do all these things. Should it be psychologically safe and worth it to share all these things? We do it because we believe, or there is evidence to show, that us utilizing and using our voice actually leads to improvement and better outcomes.
Okay. So with all of that said, so let's talk about what happens in an organization where we don't have psychological safety, and what are the impacts of that. So it's the inverse of everything that you just said, but let's give an example of what happens, right? So this is tangible for everyone who's watching and listening right now.
So I actually think it might be worth, if I could, Jay, to dig in a little bit to the thesis of the book.
Sure.
So a couple things. So one, I'm a fan of psychological safety in the body of work, but I got some beef. And the beef is not the best term, doesn't really describe what it is, kind of puts an academic lab coat on top of a very real human thing. And most of the work up until recently has been highly inaccessible, hard to action upon, and highly academic. There's a book that came out a couple years ago called The Psychological Safety Playbook. Very good. It's from my friends Minette Norman and Caroline Helbig, and it's all around moves. Try this, do this. Brilliant. So good. And so when I started to write my book, I very consciously made the choice to attempt to rebrand psychological safety. I leaned into good old Zig Ziglar, people don't buy drills, they buy holes. If the drill is psychological safety, the whole of what you get is a speak-up culture. Let's talk about that. But as I delved into it, I realized that there's more to a speak-up culture than only psychological safety. One question we ask before we speak up, either consciously or subconsciously, is it safe? But safety itself is not enough. It also needs to be worth it. If it is both safe and worth it, we're willing to overcome the discomfort, the risk, the fear, to speak up, right? Because it's seldom without risk and seldom without fear and seldom without discomfort. It's hard. Hopefully, if we have a culture where it's so practiced and so obvious, the sort of threshold becomes lower and lower. It's easier and easier to speak up the more we do it, and the more we expand. But psychological safety alone is not enough, because it could feel safe to speak up, but not worth it. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you and I go back 25 years, we were best of friends, and you see that I'm doing something in my life or career that's getting in the way of my success, and you have an intervention. You build the courage to say, hey, Shed, we have to talk. There's something you're doing that's getting in your way. And I'm so thankful, and I'm in tears, and we hug, and Jay, the conversation couldn't have gone better. And I successfully do nothing over the next 3 months to change any of my behavior. And you build the courage again, you enlist other friends and my family, you try different things, like you have another intervention, couldn't have gone better. And I successfully do nothing over the next 3 months to change any of my behavior. Like, how many times do you go back to that dry well, even if it feels really safe, right? You can say anything to me. I receive it well with humility and trust, and even accountability in that moment, but I do nothing, change anything. In the end, even if it's safe, it'll feel futile or apathetic, right? At best. And, how many times do you go back to a dry well before you give up and look for water elsewhere?
Sure.
So I learned that it's psychological safety alone isn't enough. Now, if it doesn't feel safe, it means that we're creating more tension. We're taking lubrication out of the machine, right? If it's neither safe nor worth it, that's an unhappy marriage between psychological danger and apathy or futility. And that's where we see resignation or quiet quitting, or sort of, giving the bare minimum just not to get fired and continue to collect a paycheck. But I sure as heck ain't giving more or sharing anything further. There's no evidence to say it's worth it. I'll just get in trouble and nothing's going to change. The other sort of quadrant is where courageous leadership will often show up, where it doesn't feel safe, but it feels worth it. This is where Ed Pearson found himself at Boeing, where he looked around and said, we're not making safe planes. Our processes aren't right. There's half-made parked planes in our employee parking lot. Our vendors can't keep like, this is not good. People are working too hard. Quality's going, like, stop the line, right? He literally said to the GM of the Renton, Washington facility, where all the Maxes are still made to this day. They're not being made now because they're on strike. At this moment, let's see what happens by the time this podcast comes out. But he said to the person who's once or twice removed from the CEO of the entire company, we need to stop the line. To which the response was, this is a for-profit company. We can't stop the line. And Ed's like, yeah, you can, right? And he ended up whistleblowing because he exhausted all internal options. So when we don't have psychological safety, futility, apathy, fear can overcome us, and we stay silent, or we only speak up, but selectively, right? We don't lie, but we don't share the whole truth. And so everyone loses when you don't have a speak up culture.
Yeah, I think that for everyone that's watching and listening right now, first of all, I say this on podcasts from time to time, make sure that you're taking notes and that you go back and re-listen to this, because what Shed just explained, I'm sure that we can all relate to at least one, two, or maybe all of those scenarios. I know I definitely can. I can imagine myself back in my corporate career sitting in meetings where I didn't feel safe saying something, but it would have been worth it to do so. And I kept my mouth closed because obviously I was concerned about, what's going to be the fallout from this? What's the ramification by speaking up? Because I had seen examples of what happens in a certain company culture when you do speak up. And so do make sure that you are going back and making sure that you understand these different areas. And let's talk then about what we can do, Shed, to shift or change a culture if we have one that we don't feel psychologically safe, or we don't feel that we can speak up. What's a good starting point for someone who either is on a leadership team, someone who is maybe an employee at an organization? What can they do?
So to create a speak up culture, it's a virtuous cycle of two actions, and it's virtuous because it ripples. It has a ripple effect. And this is both, there is more of a responsibility on those who hold more influence in a culture, because when you hold more influence, your individual values and behavior bear more weight. And I use the word influence because there's capital L and lowercase l leaders, right? Capital L leaders have the title, have authority, have influence sort of built in, but we all know lowercase l leaders who they may not be the most senior, they may not even have a title of leadership, but they set the beat and the pulse of a team. That's your informal leader. And so they have influence. So the more influence you have, the louder your whisper becomes, and your tiptoes are stomps. So to create a speak up culture, it's a virtuous cycle between encouraging folks to speak up and rewarding them when they do. Encourage means that people are made to believe that their voice is welcome. You ask open-ended questions, you leave room for silence, there's multiple ways to provide feedback. It's not just speak up in the meeting or else. There's anonymous polls, there's written feedback. Like, you're doing everything you can to garner illicit voice, right? My favorite example of encourage comes from aviation. Guy by the name of Ben Berman, who's now retired pilot. He used to fly for United, and he had 4 stripes on his shoulder. He was a senior pilot. And every time he went to fly, he said to his flight crew, "I've never flown a perfect flight, and today's no exception. I need to know what you see." It's a wonderful example. I've never done a perfect RFP. I've never done a perfect client pitch. I've never done wow, that's encourage. Now, if people take the bait and they're like, all right, I'll speak up. I'll share an idea. I'll share some feedback. I'll share a concern that might be unpopular or personal. I'll disagree, especially with my senior leader. I'll admit a mistake. What happens then? Are you rewarded? Now, you still need to speak up with tact and decency and respect and situational awareness and emotional intelligence. That's kind of the common denominator of what a speak up culture is. It's not chaos where you're speaking up about all the things all the time. That could be inappropriate or oversharing, right? Vulnerability, effective vulnerability requires context. But inside of a speak up culture, speaking up is rewarded, even if it isn't done perfectly, even if it isn't done at the right time, and especially when it's bad news or something hard to hear. Reward is far less extrinsic. Some of those things like promotion, raise, bonus may come in time. Reward is far more intrinsic. Thank you. Jay, that must have taken courage. I appreciate you sharing that. Jay, I don't yet see what you're pointing toward or how you got to that conclusion. Can you share more? What's behind this intuition of yours, right? That's reward. I just both disagreed with you and gave you more airtime, right? We didn't implement your idea, but here's why. Who can help us navigate some of these obstacles? That's still a reward, right? You must reward people. And I'll often have leaders come to me and say, yeah, but I asked for a speak up culture and all people do is complain. And I go, good. They think it's actually worth it to. Behind every complaint is a commitment. Meet them where they're at, hear them, validate them, understand, and then try to shift in what you can create. Does it take more time and energy? Yeah, it's called leadership. You have to do it to be effective, So that's it. Now, a lot of that is more top-down focused, or the folks who have just sort of more traditional power or influence.
Right.
If you're someone who doesn't have a ton of power, and let's say you want to speak up the chain to folks more senior, now you got to practice some Jedi leadership stuff. You got to build more relationship and empathy with those more senior to you. You have to try to understand what's the most generous interpretation of what they're doing or why. How are they valid in what they're doing, even if you disagree with it? And in building more relationship with them, relationship is the foundation of accomplishment, and you can actually take more risks because they feel that you're not coming after their job, and they feel that you're there to support. And then you can, ask for an inch, not a mile. So I've heard some brilliant stories of folks speaking up to very senior leaders and like CEOs and owners saying, I'm not expecting to change your mind in this meeting. All I'm asking you to do is sleep on it, and let's see if anything changes from now until tomorrow morning. I'm not speaking up or sharing this to be a nuisance. I'm truly committed to where we're going. I just think there's a different or better way that we can do it. All I ask is you consider, and let's see if anything shifts for you once you give it some time to breathe.
This is so good. Sounds like a great coaching opportunity, great opportunity for a mentor to share something with a mentee in this regard. I love this. So I also mentioned at the top of the show how pickle brine relates to culture. So share your thoughts around that.
Yes. So I liken culture to pickle jars. And the reason is that you can take a perfectly great cucumber to whatever your taste, put it in some awful pickle brine, and it becomes an awful pickle. But you can't blame the cucumber. You have to examine the brine, right? Wells Fargo is a good example of this. You had some very good, hardworking, talented, ethical people who were working up against a broken system that had them selling way too many accounts per capita. There were some towns with folks had 7 bank accounts. No one needs 7 bank accounts, right? They were incentivized to do the wrong thing and unethical things. Now, the people don't get off, complete scot good, but you have to examine what they were operating within, right? The good thing about human beings is, unlike a pickle, once you ferment a cucumber, you can't re-ferment it and hope it becomes a different pickle. Once you pickle a pickle, it's a pickle. But for us human beings, we can actually take ourselves from one jar, put ourselves in another, and we can transform for the better. And there's countless examples of folks that we've given up upon in society, put them in a good environment, and they are wonderful, capable, contributing citizens. This is the impact of culture. And so oftentimes someone is underperforming and we blame them without looking at, are they being well led? What's their incentive system? Is there an alignment with their skill set and strength set and the role that they're in? There's always more to the story. And so I think we have to examine what is the brine. And then even better, we can set the brine. So if I'm a leader and I really want to create a speak up culture in the small team that I lead, or my business or my company, whatever it might be, I can think, okay, how do I encourage and reward people for speaking up, right? Let's say you report into me and you, in a one-on-one meeting, you challenged me and you made me reconsider something. I go, oh my God, Jay, that's fantastic. I was pretty against it when you started, but now since you've pointed that out, you've really changed my mind. I think that's a really good direction. Let's bring this to the team. And I show, hey, I really want to reward and call Jay out. He brought some different research and data that had me completely rethink this. And we're doing this, or this is what I'm thinking. What do you think, team? And they're like, finally, right? Or they go, actually, I see it different. And I'm like, ooh, cool. The debate gets thicker. Let's lean in, right? I'm completely attached to merit. I'm not attached to hunch or bias or anything like that. So how do we actually model and show the team, if I actually want to speak up culture, I have to lead vulnerably and with humility to make it so and bring it to life to affect that brine.
Wow, this is so powerful. And I tell you what, the timing of our conversation, the timing of your book is just outstanding. So part of what we're talking about today, because there's some very interesting nuances to what you're saying that I'm actually going to apply tomorrow. I've got a board meeting tomorrow, and there's already a couple of situations where being able to encourage others to speak up without fear of reprisal is going to be very important for this organization to continue to move forward. So I want to thank you so much for sharing all that you have shared today. So
Great.
Shed,
My pleasure.
As we thank you. So as we are getting close to wrapping up our conversation, I would love it if you would share with us what one or two bigger questions are that you're asking yourself today. It can be business, personal, but one or two big questions.
Ooh. I mean, a really big question is the world we live in today one that I wish for my kids to inherit? And how do I do everything I can to try to make it so?
Wow.
That's one.
A big one. That's a good one. Okay.
The other is marry myself to the function and not the format or the form. I have a little startup and we're trying to democratize leadership development, access to leadership development. And we've got some big goals. We don't make up the story that we're the only player in that game. We strive to contribute to that infinite game of leaders developing better. But yeah, we have some big, hairy, audacious goals. And I have a very small and mighty team. And I'm just really married to doing what we need and bringing folks on board to the team in whatever way, whether they're freelancers or agencies or contractors or employees or advisors or whatever. I'm just married to how can we objectively look at what do we want to get done, and then what's the best, most effective, efficient, smart with our resources way of making that happen.
Outstanding. Love those two big questions.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
My final question to you is this. If you were giving your one last talk, your one final talk, what would you want the message to be?
Your greatest strength. Pardon me. Scratch that.
Okay.
Your greatest weakness or limitation is your greatest strength in hiding. And your genius lives on the other side of your greatest weakness or limitation.
Well, that's a good one. All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's fantastic. Shed, I want to thank you again so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. What a brilliant conversation. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, your insights, and of course, bringing your book, Speak Up Culture, to life. What a game changer for so many of us. And just want you to know that I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Please let me know how that board meeting goes tomorrow. And if there's one more bit of advice I can give, is when you're trying to create a speak up culture and just encouraging, you can make a promise and say, please speak up. It'll go better than you think. And then let people do it. And then you have to promise that it goes better than they think. Because if they bring the goody goods and share some bad news or hard things to hear, that's the time to breathe and go, hard to hear, and thank you. Now let's figure out what we can do with that data.
I will definitely do that. Thank you for those parting words. That's outstanding. And for all of you, I want to thank you so very much for watching and for listening. And I do have a quick favor for you. Would you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? That helps us expand our reach and attract amazing guests just like Shed. And to listen to more episodes, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click that podcast button, and until next time, my friends, keep learning, keep growing. Make sure that you run out to pick up a copy of Speak Up Culture, and apply the lessons you learn. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.